All right, so I'm going to show you how to start a compost pile from the beginning. First thing, easiest if you already have a corner with walls. Not required. You could just build it up with extra cinder block. Just makes it easier, less cinder block. 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, so width, height, length. It's kind of what you're shooting for, but I actually expanded mine slightly, just a little bit more than that. So I'll talk about what the greens are, what the browns are, what goes in there. You can see right here, this is actually the compost I had in there last night that was just 3 weeks old, and it's already mostly into soil. So this is gonna go into the garden today. I just wanted to show you what it looks like and how quick it can actually turn into soil here. So the first thing you're gonna do that I'd recommend is find some sticks. Little logs, small sticks. These aren't to decompose. I mean, it's gonna take years. It helps so that you get air at the bottom of the compost pile, because what happens is, especially as you're adding to it, as you're putting water on it, it's gonna compress. And as it compresses, it's gonna squeeze out the air. Now for your compost pile to work, it needs 3 things. It needs air, oxygen. It's gonna need fuel, so your greens and browns, for the microbes to break down. And it's gonna need moisture, so water. Anytime you're missing one of those, it's gonna stop working, or if you have too much of something, it can throw it off too. So we're gonna throw down wood. I'll show you how to do that. All right, so the best thing you can do with this, you're gonna want to get it somewhat flat. The problem is, once you go to try to turn your compost with your pick or your shovel, you're not gonna be able to move this part. What will inevitably happen as your compost pile grows, the bottom half is going to be ready while the top half will still be composting if you add to it like I do. The way around that is you could do 2 different compost piles if you have the space for it. If you do that, then what you would do is you'd get one ready, get it to the size you want, keep on turning it, keep on adding moisture to it, but then you're going to just let it sit over the winter, and that'll be soil for next year. And then your table scraps would start going into the new one, so you'd build a new one after your first pile gets to the size you want. So we have our base here. I'm going to show you a bit of what's going to go into this. So I have the chicken bedding with a little bit of the droppings here. That's a mixture of brown and green. The bedding itself, which is the bulk of it, that's browns. But their waste, that's pretty high concentrated greens. Now your browns are generally going to be something dry. They're going to be a carbon base. Your greens are going to be nitrogen based. So think of it, if it were to sit on your counter and start, or just sit there for a week, is it going to start to, I mean, you can imagine what this would do, a banana. It's going to smell, it's going to be oozy, it's going to be gross. That's because it's rich in nitrogen. It's got, it's moist or damp, for lack of a better word. These were, actually, I threw them in last compost just a couple days ago, and half of them were already fully composted. Now, they're corn husk from Sunday dinner. When they're brown like this, that's gonna be, or sorry, when they're dry like this, that's gonna be your browns, carbon base. When they're green, it's gonna be greens, and it's going to be your nitrogen base. Your compost pile needs both carbon and nitrogen. Yeah, generally something that's already dried out is going to be your browns, and if it's still green or not completely dead and dry, it's going to be greens for the most part. This is kind of a mixture of both, actually. It's half dry, half not. These corn husks from corn that was already used, these came out of the last compost pile. That's like wood right now, so that is definitely brown. The one thing on your compost too, if it's a brown, the smaller you can get it, the better it's going to be, the quicker it's going to decompose. So as you can break things up smaller, they will decompose quicker. Cardboard is a brown too. Again, the smaller you can get it, the better it's going to be. So I actually have a bunch here cut pretty small. You could throw it in like that, it just takes longer. All right, And your goal here is to throw in layers when you're building it up. So start with your layer of sticks like I have behind, and then you're going to build green, brown, and then just kind of give it a good mix. Now I'm going to show you a couple of tools that I have. I'm a cheap gardener. I don't like to buy anything I don't have to. And when I was going to buy this pitchfork, I was thinking to myself, why would I buy a pitchfork that I'm not going to use that's $40 to $60 at the store? Well, this is an essential. If you're going to get a compost pile, you need to get a good pitchfork like this. So that is one expense you're going to have to get. I'm also going to show you what I do when I start a compost, or if I feel like my compost has slowed down. This right here is fully composted steer manure from the local garden store. It's $2, very cheap. This is very high nitrogen, but it's also partially composted, so it's really more like a soil. It's too hot. When I say too hot, it means it's still putting off heat. If I were to put this directly into my garden bed without amending it with regular soil, it would probably kill the plants or at least traumatize them. So you would need to mix this in with regular soil. A 1-to-1 part would probably work fine. But when I put this into my compost pile, it's gonna speed it up. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a layer of browns, a layer of greens, and then a layer of this, which is actually also a green, because it's still kicking off nitrogen from that steer manure. Then I add water, then I repeat the process. All right, one thing that I forgot to talk about, well, two things. Your garden scraps. So these are obviously rich in green. This is an artichoke leaf, so I'm gonna talk about this at a different time, how you take care of your artichokes, but they need a constant haircut or shave just to keep them looking good. They put out these leaves pretty quickly and they take over a lot of space. So that's gonna be one of our greens in the compost as well. Another question that I get, or that comes to mind, is with chickens, when would you want to give it to the chicken and when would you want to put it to the compost? If it's an herb, so we have cilantro, we have lettuce, we have broccoli, stuff like that from the garden, I will typically give that to the chickens as a treat instead. Sometimes if they don't need it, I'll put it in the compost. I feel it has a greater benefit going to them than to the compost. Anything that might be going bad, those bananas, table scraps, those are probably something that should go in a compost. If it's moldy fruit, compost it, don't give it to the chickens. Okay, I love garden clippings, artichokes, stuff like that, because it fills out your compost when you're first starting out. If your compost isn't big enough, it's just not gonna do much. So you're really shooting for 2 to 3 feet tall and 2 to 3 feet wide to get it to be an active compost pile. So initially, not a big deal if you have more greens than browns. If you get too much, that's when a compost pile might become stinky, if it's really, really heavy on greens. But I've never really had the issue of needing to balance it out. It seems to balance itself to a large degree. So I'm gonna put some of this down. And what's crazy is within a week, these will be soil. It goes that quick here when you have a good pile. All right, so that's a green layer. This is, again, a mixture of green and brown. The bedding is brown, but it has some droppings in it, so that's green. It's pretty heavy on both, but I'm gonna throw that in as my next layer. And there's enough bedding in there to act as a brown and complement the green. All right, I could throw some cardboard, another brown, just space it out. And then I like bananas. And again, we don't waste all our bananas. Often they'll go in the freezer and they'll become banana bread or something. But when we have too many, they'll go in a compost. We don't buy them just to compost them, but no need to break them up. I'm only breaking them up so I can spread them out. These compost incredibly quick. All right, then I'm gonna add another layer, green. And this is where my stinking rich comes in. All right, the last step I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add some water and get this really damp. And then when I have big leaves in there like artichokes, I'm not gonna bother giving it a stir for a couple of days. I'm gonna let it do its thing. And then those will start to break down really quickly because there's a lot of nitrogen in there. At that point, I'll come back and I'll start stirring it in about 2 days. When it comes to your compost and water, you want it damp like a sponge. Now, when it becomes bigger, that typically means the top's gonna be really wet and it will slowly saturate down to the lower level. But damp like a sponge is what you're shooting for. When your compost gets too big, what tends to happen is the bottom gets dry and the top will still be wet. The other thing is, like I said here, this was at the bottom of my old compost and this is only 3 weeks old, while the top was still pretty compostable. When you go to turn it, you're gonna find you're lucky if you're getting 18 to 20 inches down with the pick. So too big, I guess, can be bad. Okay, so we did this 2 days ago. What I haven't done is I haven't mixed it. I haven't added water like we talked about. And as I thought about it, I wonder if we actually have enough browns in there for a new starting out compost. Once you have it going, it's really easy. You can just throw your table scraps in, give it a stir, and you're usually pretty good. I used chicken bedding, nesting box bedding for my browns, but I realized a lot of you aren't going to have that, so you could use a number of things. You could use cardboard cut up. You could use dried leaves. In the fall, I use all of the leaves from the tree and really get a big compost pile going. One other thing that I thought about too is when you use grass. Grass is a green, like grass clippings, but you need to be careful because when your grass goes to seed, you're gonna have so many grass seeds in there that you're gonna have to fight with. So if you're gonna throw your grass clippings into your compost, make sure it hasn't gone to seed. And this is for my front yard. It's not very tall, but it still has already gone to seed, so I'd keep that out of there. All right, I did sprinkle on a tiny bit of coffee grounds, which are actually a green, which we got from Starbucks. They give them out free to gardeners. And then you can see I threw a few, like yesterday I had an avocado and I threw that in there. So I'm just gonna give it a mix and see how it's looking. Okay, so a couple of things. I can feel heat coming off of it. Not as much as I want, but it's new. And this is as dry as I would want to get it. I say damp like a sponge is what you're shooting for. And that is, but by the end of today in our heat, that'll probably be completely dry. So it needs some water. I think it has enough brown to green ratio. It just needs more water and a little more time. So from here though, I can add in the table scraps, I can add in other things and just give it a stir. So I would add water every day to 2 and then stir it every day or 2. Stirring it is gonna help add oxygen because if you recall, we talked about how the natural tendency of a compost pile is to compress. As it does that, it pushes out all of the air. And so that's the whole point of stirring it. When you stir it, you are mixing up the brown to green ratio, but the whole point is to add more oxygen back in there. So remember, there's 3 components: oxygen, fuel, and moisture. And you need to make sure you have all of those going. Now, how do you know when your compost pile's done? If it's no longer kicking off heat, if you've had earthworms move into it, if it's looking and smelling like soil, then that's gonna be telling you that you're good to go and you can add it into your compost or your flower beds and garden beds. Some of the soil that came from the compost right here, I'm gonna show you. And it's really rich, has everything that they need, the plants need. The problem is, compost doesn't ever fully get hot enough, at least mine doesn't, to get all of the weed seeds out. It does a good job at a lot, but not all. So it's a little bit of work, but it's a lot cheaper than buying all the soil, and it's healthy soil. So I just come in here and weed it daily. Just pull out. Mostly it's grass clippings. Get a lot of pumpkin seeds from last year's pumpkin that we carved, and I just rip them up and let them just decompose back into the soil. These are actually pumpkins, but I'm gonna let them grow because they're in with the corn, and that should do okay together. There's another. So it's a little extra work, but this whole bed, which 18 inches, was all full or filled with the compost from last year.